Greetings, everyone. My name is Emily Louie, and on behalf of Campbell & Company, I would like to welcome you to Fundraising Communications 2, one of 5 webinars in our free communications webinar series. Thanks for joining us. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly go through some logistics for those of you who may be new to our webinars. First, please close any programs other than GoToWebinar that are running on your computer. Next, we recommend calling in with the telephone instead of using your computer speakers. This will improve your audio experience. Next, move your cell phone away from your computer. And lastly, if you experience visual issues, send a chat to Campbell & Company or contact GoToWebinar at the number on your screen. Today's webinar will last 60 minutes, and you'll earn 1 continuing education credit that is good with your participation with CFRE International. Within the next 24 hours, you will receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes information on how to download your certificate. We won't be sharing slides from today's presentation, but we will be sending a link to the recording in the follow-up email from GoToWebinar. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar. Please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel that should be on the right side of your computer screen. We will also be holding time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Andy Brommel, Director of Communications Consulting here at Campbell & Company.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Those of you who've done these with us before will notice that I'm not in the usual Campbell & Company webinar cave, as it is currently negative 14 degrees here in Chicago with a wind chill of negative 40. Several adults who care about me were able to prevail on me and not go into the office and to just try to do this from home. So I hope the tech setup and the audio quality is okay. But yes, joining you from Andersonville in Chicago today. I mean, I grew up in Minnesota, so I kind of feel like all this cold weather stuff doesn't really apply to me. But I'm glad you could join. And today's topic about messaging is really actually my favorite of the webinars that we do. So I hope you're somewhere warm and ready to dig into it with us. So this, just as a reminder, we do a series of fundraising communications webinars every year that reflect the experience and ideas of our communications team at Campbell & Company. We're a little unique in that we have, it's almost like a communications or creative agency within a national fundraising firm, and that's the team that I work on. And so we're coming from with this webinar series, we're coming from kind of the broad insight that fundraising is really about communications. It's about your ability to convey and engage an audience with a message about a cause. That every fundraiser is in some way a communicator, or is part of the work of communications in different ways. But that most organizations struggle to really invest in fundraising communications, to pay attention to it on the level that they maybe should. Very few places have a dedicated fundraising communications or development communications staff. Most often this is something that's kind of also someone's job, like it's down there 5th or 6th on somebody's list of priorities. So there's just a lot of need out there for nonprofits to think more and to maybe spend a little more time and energy on the communications aspect of their fundraising programs, and we think that can drive a lot of results. So the webinar series has 5 installments, and if this is our second one. If you missed our first one, that's fine. Nothing in here totally depends on it, although we'll refer back to a couple things. You can find all of our archived webinars on the Campbell & Company YouTube channel or page. So if you want to go follow up and check out what was in Fundraising Communications 1 after this, you can easily find that on our YouTube page. The next 3 sessions in the series continue some of the ideas that we'll be talking about today. The next one features Christina Black and Kelsey Nelson, who are extremely talented members of our communications and fundraising teams, and they're going to talk about engaging volunteers with your case. Once you've got your messaging down, how do you get your volunteers comfortable using it, your board members in particular. We added this session because we just kept seeing that so many organizations struggle with this. And Christina and Kelsey bring a really smart training and coaching mindset grounded in adult education practices to think with you about how to actually get your volunteers comfortable using your case. It's going to be a great session. In May, I'm going to do a session with Anna Gorin, who leads our communications work out in Seattle. We're going to talk all about fundraising materials, brochures, presentation decks, videos, web materials, digital things, and all around the question of, once you've got your message and your case figured out, how do you actually produce stuff that makes it easier for you to do fundraising work, to go out and talk to donors. And then finally, the 5th session in July, I'm going to be joined by my colleague Pat, who's a senior consultant on our communications team here in Chicago. Pat and I are going to talk all about campaigns, all the unique case development and communications challenges that arise in campaigns. So that's going to be another very useful session for any of you who are in campaigns or preparing for campaigns, or you're a fundraiser, so you are going to do campaigns in your life. It's a good chance to dive deeper on that. So as we go through today, as Emily mentioned, please do ask questions. Unless I really ramble egregiously, we should have a good amount of time for questions at the end of this. And the last one of these that we did, we got great questions. So I'm looking forward to that at the end of our session today. So without further ado, let's dive in. I want to start by talking about the power of messages. Why should you care about this? Why should you spend time thinking about this as a distinct challenge and task next to case development? This is the reason we divided these up into 2 webinars. Case development webinar number 1 is all about figuring out what are your core ideas, what are you trying to express. But then there's this whole separate question, this is messaging, about how do you express it? How do you take your ideas and put them into words? So let's start with a quick working definition. And I didn't pull this from a dictionary or from anything very official, I just kind of made it up based on functionally what we're talking about here. We're talking about a message as being kind of just a simple expression of an idea that is designed to move an audience. That's all we're really talking about. But you can see there's already kind of a lot going on in there. For instance, it has to be simple. It's about expressing, it's about reaching an audience. It has to have a single central idea. We'll come back to that. And the whole thing is all about moving an audience and taking them from where they are today to some other state of mind or some other understanding. So it's very audience driven. And when we talk about moving an audience, that can mean engaging them, inspiring them, getting their attention, spurring them to action. It can be changing their understanding, moving them from a place of sort of fuzziness about some aspect of your work to a place of really clear understanding. The point is, these are just like statements and ways of expressing an idea that are really engineered to do something in the world. So when you start thinking about it that way, you start to see that, sorry, dealing with my screen here. Messages is everywhere. Yes, they is. Messages are everywhere, and this is going to be very clear to us over the next couple of years as our entire consciousness is subsumed by electoral politics. And this is completely obvious in a political setting. You're always hearing about, what's their message to this segment of voters or that audience, and is that message going to play in West Virginia? So we're very used to this idea in the political world. These are some sample messages. The one on the left, no one in this country should work full time and still live in poverty. That's from Elizabeth Warren. I think that was from a speech she gave a few years ago. Very clear, simple message designed to move an audience. The one on the right is actually a bit older. That government is best, which governs least. This is from Henry David Thoreau, actually, from Civil Disobedience in 1849, although you can tell that's an idea or a message that has been very effective and has, sustained itself. You could imagine maybe with slightly different syntax hearing that from Ronald Reagan or, or other conservatives. So these are just samples. We're all gonna be thinking and hearing about messaging over the next few years. And what you start to see, even when you look at these very simple political examples, is these are just simple little statements, but they already start to feel like the building blocks of a worldview. You can kind of see how they structure your view of a topic, and they're trying to get in your mind and shape the way you view things. And the other thing they're doing is that they're speaking to values and identity. When you interact with this kind of language, what it's pulling forward in you is a sense of your values and who you are as a person. We're going to talk about that a lot. Good messaging, effective messaging, is very strongly anchored in values and identity. That's what gives it basically its charge. Those are frankly the things that we care about. What kind of person am I? What kind of world do I want to live in? What do I value? That's what, that's the kind of stuff that can get us fired up. So that's political examples, but also, in the world of business and retail and commerce, and there are promotional messages for products and services and all that. This is probably, I would say, like the most effective marketing message that maybe there's ever been. This De Beers, "A Diamond is Forever." With this campaign and this message, which was sustained over many years, and you see it here, it's expressed both verbally and visually. These guys really, really succeeded in just structuring our collective consciousness to equate an idea of lifetime monogamous commitment, marital commitment, and like a specific type of rock. Like, they succeeded in making those things the same in all of our brains, and they've structured collective consciousness through a use of very effective, clear, consistent messaging. So, in politics, in retail, in the economy, we're surrounded by messages. Meanwhile, over here in the nonprofit sector, we tend to have a communication style that is not as message driven, especially when we're talking to our donors or we're making the case for ourselves. We're trying to answer that question of why do you matter? Why should someone care? Why should they give? We tend to respond in a communication style that does not have as much of a focus on clear messages. I think there are some reasons for that. I think it's kind of who we are as nonprofit-y people. We tend to be a little allergic to things that feel overly promotional or salesy. We come to this with a deep earnestness and passion and a level of interest in a cause that we kind of assume everyone else is going to have. And, and the sector it's very educated, it's very professionalized now, and we sort of badly want to be taken seriously as nonprofit people. So we always feel like we're like trying to, be taken seriously alongside businesses and other things. So we tend to talk in this way that, and the other thing is just like a lot of nonprofits don't have really strong investment in marketing expertise. They'll have a marketing or a communications program, but it's small and it's not the main focus, and the staff is really limited, and everyone's got too many jobs to do. So we just tend not to be very good at messaging. And so I'm not here to tell you in this webinar that, that we have to sort of be like the politicians or be like the retailers, or, run your nonprofit like a business or any of that kind of, sort of simplistic formulations of this. I want to share some thoughts about how we can find a place for the power of messaging within the nonprofit sector, because I really believe, and we know that every one of your organizations has something really important to say, and we want to help you be more effective, consistent, and confident in saying it, especially to your donor audience. So as we get into this, I think it's helpful not to immediately try to start like editing this copy on this fake protest sign that I came up with, but to actually start from a different place and kind of get into a different mindset. So think about what would happen if you asked your board or your staff members this question, which we've done with boards in the past. Sometimes we'll do this at the beginning of a case development session just to kind of get everyone thinking and reframing how they're approaching the exercise. We'll ask them, pick an organization you support that's not the one that you work for, or that you're not the one that you're a part of. Pick a different organization. Why do you give money to them? If you give people just a couple minutes to think about this, go around the room, have them share, you hear people give very simple, short, earnest and passionate explanations that often have 2 or 3 or 4 key points in them. It's rarely more complicated than that, even when you're talking to very sophisticated nonprofit people, like you're talking to yourselves, to your staff. You know, people have simple understandings of organizations and why they matter. I did this exercise for myself the other day as I was preparing this, and I thought about one organization that I've started supporting a lot more over the last year or so is called Give Direct. And what it is you give money and they make direct cash transfers to the poorest people on earth. It's not more complicated than that. But I got engaged by this organization because to me, why I support them, just to answer the question, is because it's starting to look like that may, among all the fancy, complicated interventions we can make in other countries, just giving people cash may make the most difference, or maybe one of the things that makes the most difference. The impact is immediate, which I like, and it sort of respects the agency of the people that you're giving to. It's not saying I know what's best for you. It's saying I trust you. You know what's best for you. Here is money. Go, invest in what values most to you and your family. So that's, I think about cases for support all day, but then with my actual giving, my reasons for giving are, again, it's not really more complicated than 3 points. So doing that exercise, I think, gets you out of your overcomplicated thinking about your case and reminds you people approach this stuff with a mental picture that consists of a small set of really important ideas about an organization that also reflect who that person is and how they approach their own giving. So that being the case, this is why, if you remember back to the first webinar in the series, when we defined what your case for support is, we said it's a set of messages that you communicate to prepare your prospects for a solicitation. Our goal in developing cases with organizations, producing materials, coming up with messaging, training boards on messaging, on how to communicate, all that stuff, is to get really, really clear around a core set of messages that we think can reach the audience, build that mental picture for them of the organization, and inspire them to give. So we're looking for, people can think of 3 or 4 or 5 things in their head about your organization. What do we want those to be? What do we think will be most effective? And how do we kind of turn those into these very clear, purposeful statements, and then build all our communications around those? So here's some examples. We've been conceptual for long enough. Talking about a simple expression of an idea that's designed to move an audience. I love this one. Alzheimer's disease is the defining public health challenge of our time. Simple, makes a point, asks you to kind of move somewhere to a new understanding. Another good one, no child should miss out on a great education for financial reasons. You can imagine that in any different school or scholarship campaign or university. So this is, again, that's really speaking to values. You feel yourself morally summoned by that message. Here's a real simple one, another school example. It's our turn to invest in the future of our school. So think of the context here you're doing a campaign for a school, and what you're saying to people is, hey, you inherited this school. Your kid today is benefiting from buildings that other people built, endowments that other people gave to, and just generations of faculty and staff and donors and families who have all, in turn, done their part to make the school stronger and to make it great today. And now you and your child are benefiting from that, and it's our turn now to invest in the future. So that's sort of the context in which that kind of message would make sense. So as we look at just these simple examples, one thing I want to point out is they all have one core idea. None of them have any sort of fancy language going on. These are not like really powerful or they don't draw attention to the writing, I guess is what I'm saying. And the other thing that I think is a good test for these is, could you imagine a person in your community saying these things to someone else? Like, could they transmit by word of mouth? And I think these messages pass that test. So that's why we think about using messages, well-defined, strong messages, as the building blocks of a strong case. We want to think about not how can we get to the best, fullest, most fully elaborated case statement, but how can we get to a really good set of core messages? That's how we approach our projects. I want to make a couple clarifying points that come up in these projects and in conversations about messaging. The first is about kind of how your message and your mission relate to each other, because people will say, well, of course we have a message, it's our mission statement. And sometimes those are really good, I don't know, one statement can serve both, but usually there's a difference. Mission tends to be for your internal audience and about kind of clarifying and clarifying things and rallying your staff and your internal stakeholders. Messaging is purely about or very strongly tilted toward the external audience. Mission is about defining purpose and being precise about what you do and don't do and why. And message is about, once you're clear, once you have a clear mission, how do you sort of take that out of doors? How do you express that purpose and identity for external stakeholders? And mission, the point of that is to help internal stakeholders guide organizational decisions, whereas a message is about kind of meeting external stakeholders where they are and understanding their mindset and thinking about how you can bring them closer. So they do need to be compatible, obviously, need to be pointing in the same direction, but they don't have to be the same thing. And they can actually use pretty different vocabulary just because of who they're speaking to. So I just want to be clear about that. The other thing I want to make clear is that messaging does not replace substance. We're going to talk, in most of this webinar, we're going to look at very simple statements that but these are, the intention is not that like, oh, if you just get that one message or that one tagline right or something, then all of a sudden, like, you don't have to say anything more than that. It's not that, it doesn't replace substance or, all the details and facts and proof points and supporting points that you might need to bring in, but it does bring structure to that substance, and it makes all of that information intelligible to people and memorable. So what I mean is that it's the difference between having this like kind of brick of a statement that's like all information and having really clear messages that bring structure to it, make it intelligible, and then you can still have all the substance that goes along with those. So here you see kind of the hierarchy. We've taken this big chunk of text. We've broken it down into 5 master messages, and then for each of those there might be a handful of supporting points that are statistics or stories or proof points or just whatever. So it brings structure to information, it makes it more intelligible, and it makes it more memorable, because ideally, if you're doing your work right, and this example is about a food bank. It's pretty similar to the example we used in the first webinar. But if you're doing this, ideally, these kinds of messages people might actually be able to remember and repeat. So we're talking about messaging. It's not quite the same as a tagline. It's not just a tagline. It's not your mission statement. It's about having something to say to your audience and finding a clear, consistent, effective way to say it. And it's actually a discipline that once you get comfortable with it, you can follow this at every level of communication. You can have, one big message about your vision as an organization, or 3 to 5 key messages that drive your case for support, or I'm going into this meeting, I'm meeting with my boss, I gotta move them from here to here, I'm gonna have my 3 key messages for this meeting. It's a universal communication skill once you start doing it. The other thing, you may recognize this from the last webinar, is that there's kind of a logic to how, if you focus first on establishing a core of strong messages, then everything else that you want to do afterward in terms of communicating with your donors, it becomes a lot easier. So once you've got a core case for support, a core set of messages, then it becomes easy to write annual appeals, produce cultivation materials, coach your leadership, start weaving messages, philanthropic messages into your different communications channels. You can produce tailored stuff about specific projects that still has a consistent overall message. Just everything about communications becomes easier when you know what your messages are and how to use them. Oh, and one final point. In the last webinar, we said that taking time to develop your case for support is probably the best way to make your overall fundraising program more effective across the table. Within the world of fundraising communications, focusing on messaging and doing that work is probably the cheapest way to make all of your fundraising communications more effective, because it does not cost more money to print a brochure that has good messaging versus a brochure that has weak or no messaging. This is time you can take that doesn't necessarily cost money, but that makes everything you want to communicate more effective. All right, let's keep rolling and talk about how do we actually make messages. And what you're going to see is that this actually becomes kind of a writing process or a set of writing tips. And I hope this is all, I hope even if you think of yourself as someone who doesn't like writing, hopefully these tips help you feel like, I can use these, or I can find the value and the reward in taking what I'm communicating and making it clearer and stronger. Even if you don't think of yourself as a writer, you're still writing all day. You're writing emails. We're all writing. Okay, so we're just going to go through a whole different set of tips that I've found to be useful for nonprofits. First, be direct. So we're going to show some before and afters. So here's the original. Alongside our recent investments in capital and programs, we must also invest in our school endowment to ensure our strongest future. It's fine, nothing wrong with it. But if you want to have a clear message, you need to be a little more direct about what it is we're actually trying to move people to. And I think what we're trying to move people here is the idea that the endowment is the most important investment we can make in our school's future right now. So being more direct. And now you could still follow this up with more supporting points and say, and provide more context, talk about the other things you've invested in, why it's time to do the endowment. But this is your message. This is the thing you want people to be walking away remembering. I talked to that fundraiser. They told me about where the school's at. We reviewed the strategic plan, whatever. I think the endowment's the most important thing we should be doing right now. There's your message. Look for the aha moments. When you're crafting messaging, you almost want to keep track of your own experience engaging with a topic or the experience of others or others who are around you. Try to figure out when was the moment where something became clear to you, and try to locate the message there. So here's our original. This was for a large community funder that, sort of raises a bunch of money and then sort of sprinkles it all out across a bunch of different causes. That's been their traditional model. So for nearly a century, the big umbrella funder has supported thousands of nonprofit organizations across our city. And now, as we work to take on the most challenging issues in our community, we're preparing to launch a new strategy that brings partner organizations together to tackle problems at the neighborhood level. So this is basically, the organization is about to change its strategy from sprinkling money everywhere to really picking neighborhoods, building networks and partnerships in those neighborhoods, and trying to be more structured and focused in the way they make change. So that's complicated, especially for a donor who isn't, like a board member or someone who really knows them very well. But if you want to, think about like a major donor who might, if they could understand this strategy and get excited about it, they might think that's really cool, that's really smart. I want to be a part of that. So how do you get them to that aha moment of seeing just how cool and smart this is? It seemed to me that there were potentially two messages in here. The first is, if the problems that we're tackling are all interconnected, we need interconnected solutions. If poverty, violence, housing, health, education, all that stuff, the problems in neighborhoods all reinforce each other, that means that we need solutions that bring together partners in all those issues and make them and have them work together. So interconnected problems need interconnected solutions. That's kind of interesting. The other one is, why focus on neighborhoods? For me, the aha was the strategy is based on neighborhoods because that's a scale that's big enough to really matter, but it's small enough to truly change. So there's kind of an aha. They're like, oh, that's interesting. Instead of just trying to do things across the board at the city level or at the super micro level, fund individual organizations, we're going to focus on neighborhoods as the right scale to really take on problems. I thought that was interesting. Okay, another simple approach. What's the strongest claim that you can back up? This is an example from, it's actually almost 10 years ago, a safety net hospital that does a lot of work on, so this is what they're saying. Healthcare reform is bringing a new focus on prevention, community health, and affordability. And for decades, we've already been a leader in these critical areas. Basically what they were saying is like, everyone's talking about prevention, everyone's talking about community health, everyone's talking about affordability. Hey, we over here at this really cool safety net hospital, that's what we've been saying forever. So this is sort of an explanatory version of the message. We punched it up to, where is it? There we go. American healthcare is going where we've always been. So it's stronger, it's a little bit bolder, but it's still within the realm of credibility. That's important. Don't lie. Don't say stuff you can't support. So a lot of what we do with messaging is figuring out how to make this feel as big and as exciting as it can while still keeping our feet on the ground. Don't stop until it's simple. And this is just a good, like, I think of this part of the work as taking stuff and just pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing until it's like down to a diamond. This was for a school. We've always been recognized for our outstanding academic programs, yet we know that our extracurricular and co-curricular programs can be just as important in shaping our children's lives. This was kind of the setup to a campaign where the last campaign they had done was they had already built buildings for classrooms. They had already made a bunch of academic investments, and they had a new campaign that was focused on like athletics, performing arts, like I said, extracurricular and co-curricular stuff. And it just felt like a lot to explain. So we just kept pushing on it until we arrived at, this campaign's about all the learning that happens outside the classroom. And then you kind of like, oh, I get that. I think back to my own school experience, and I remember how a lot of the most meaningful experiences I had as a student were through, clubs or music or, public speaking or like, all the stuff that happens outside the classroom. So again, keep pushing on things until they're simple. Here's a fun little test that you should be applying to most of the stuff that you write. Would a human say it? So here's my favorite example. No child should grow up in a food insecure household. Versus, I think you could take this a couple different ways. No child should go to school hungry. No parent should have to worry about where their child's next meal will come from. Think about just try saying things out loud. Imagine saying it to a friend, to a family member. If it feels weird, it's probably not a good fundraising message. And, to some extent, this is just about jargon and, recognizing that jargon has a purpose. It brings clarity to the sort of interprofessional communications that, you know, experts in a field have with each other, but it does not work outside of that bubble. So to some extent, this is just about jargon, but it's also about like just saying things that are more grounded in the sort of humanity of your causes. This, you know, making this less about households and more about children and parents, because those are actual people. Another example of this, and a way to get through that, is to just remember, build these messages and your writing in general around nouns and verbs. So here's an example. This is the kind of stuff you see in the education sector all the time. Just a list of adjectives. One thing I like to do is like go through and cross out all the adjectives and see what's left. If you cross out child-centered, transformational, holistic, the actual like working chassis of this sentence is we offer an education. And then like they've just sort of poured adjective syrup on top of that to like give it some flavor. So we would challenge this organization to, this is a fake example, we would challenge them to, what do you say, how do you say this in nouns and verbs? Here's what I came up with. It's not that great, but whatever. We give every child every chance to discover what they can become. Is that the idea that's at the heart of this? It might be. I actually don't know. This example on the left is so fuzzy and meaningless that I actually don't know what the core message is. So sometimes messaging challenges you to not just say things better, but to actually go back to the original ideas and figure out, wait, what are we really trying to say? Because when we try to say it in a really simple way, we don't know how. Okay, this is a tip that we use all the time. Don't build one of these. What is this? It's a terrible couch combined with a terrible bed. It's something that does two things poorly instead of doing one thing well. It's a futon. Don't build a futon. What I mean by that is when you're coming up with messaging, don't try to cram 2 or 3 central ideas into a single message. Be precise and have one idea per message. So here's an example of that. If our original statement is, I'm sorry that for anyone who works at a school, I feel like all the bad examples I'm using here are from schools. Don't read into it. Okay, so if our original is, the annual fund provides funding that supports a wide range of initiatives, including financial aid, faculty professional development, new program innovation, technology, and equipment. There's a lot of stuff, like that's more of a list than a message. A lot of different things going on in there. So I would look at that and say, okay, that's not really a message. What is the message? And I actually don't know, because again, it's kind of fuzzy. Sometimes, like by writing a lot, you can end up saying less, like more words, but somehow fewer clear ideas. So here's some options. I might go back to this organization and say, is the message that your annual fund gift benefits every student every day? Like, is that how you want people to be thinking about this in terms of like individual everyday experience? Your annual fund gift supports all the things we love most about our school, like going back to that value and identity of like, I love this school, this is a part of me, my child goes there, my heart is there, you know, and the annual fund sort of equals that and goes into that. That could be the message. Maybe it's just, you know, your annual fund is the most important gift you can make to benefit our students today. So like this is that last one is what we often use in a campaign where the school is worried about how do we make sure the campaign and the annual fund doesn't like cannibalize the annual fund. We'll have to really be clear. Annual fund gift is number one. Then we would love if you would consider us a special gift to the campaign. So again, messaging forces you to think about, well, what are we actually really trying to say, and be specific about it. The other part of what you see in this example on the left is a kind of cognitive error, I guess, that comes up in our work a lot, where you know, when you look at the thing on the left, it kind of reflects the way the staff and the organization would see it. It's like the annual fund is the way that we get money for financial aid, professional development, you know, technology and equipment. Like, that's what it means to us, the organization. Whereas all this stuff on the right is like thinking about it the way, from the perspective of a donor and what they might actually want or value, or like might help them feel like they're expressing some part of themselves through their gift. So messaging challenges us to sort of just to get out of our own heads. Remember that your view as the staff member is very unusual. There are only like 2 people in the entire plane who have this view. Everyone else is thinking about the journey, you know, the experience, where they're going to go, is it going to be safe? Like, so messaging is a good discipline for forcing you to think about, like, you know, like what messages do you really, I feel like the question here is like not what messages do we want to push, but more like what messages does our audience really need from us? And if you think about, like, okay, we'll stay in our air travel metaphor here. What are the messages that somebody actually needs to know and believe about a flight, about taking a flight? That it's going to get them somewhere fast, that they're not going to die, that they can afford it, and that the experience, well, it's going to be bad, won't be so unpleasant that you wish you hadn't done it. Like, that's what you need. You got to clear those hoops to buy an airplane ticket. It's going to be safe. I can afford it. It's going to be unpleasant, but not too unpleasant, and it's going to get me somewhere. Like, that's the messages they actually need. And it's just useful to remember that, because I think we spend an awful lot of time selling the airplane when we ought to be selling the journey or the destination or the experience. Look at this guy in his sweater. Nice. So how do you get into that mindset? This kind of goes back to process. To find messages, a great step is to just listen. And I actually feel like there's nothing super magical about this, other than that if you actually can do it well, you do actually become kind of a magical person. My teammates on the communications team here, I feel like a lot of ways, I mean, they're great writers, they're great consultants, but in some ways, like, they're just really good at listening for messages. So the way we do that, you know, listen to how your donors and board members talk about your organization, about your mission, the cause that you are part of, the community, about themselves. You can do this in formal ways by having interviews and workshops. I think a lot of you could do that. You know, you could take some time out and say, let's step back and talk about our organization. we're going to have a listening session. We're going to ask you 5 questions about our organization and why you support us, and just see what people say. Or, you know, you can do this just in your kind of day-to-day engagements with donors, listening to what seems to actually be driving them. The things we look for are, where's the energy? Where do you feel a connection? What are their identities and values? So when we're starting a project, we'll go spend 2 days on site with a client and, you know, take a tour and talk to everyone we can talk to, and, you know, have a bunch of interviews, have a bunch of group conversations, take it in visually, get the feel of the place. We'll just like completely immerse ourselves and get completely flooded with information. And then we come back and we sit down with our notes, and the things we usually ask are, of all that like million words that we heard, where was the energy? Like, where were the moments where people cried? Because people will cry in these conversations, I guarantee it. Where were the moments where it felt like somebody was like really just connecting with us when they were talking? And how do these people see themselves? Like, what about themselves does this organization speak to? So you can do this. We do this. It's not magic. You can do this. And what that gets you closer to, let's say, it doesn't guarantee it, but it gets you closer to an ability to not always be pushing messaging, but to have messaging that actually pulls at someone's identity and values. We'll have moments in projects where we've been doing a lot of writing, we're getting all fired up about a project, and we're kind of drinking the Kool-Aid with our clients to some extent. And we'll step back and look at this and be like, all this stuff is like push. All this messaging is just pushing. So here's an example. For 25 years, we, this organization, we've led the climate conversation in our state, built strong partnerships with organizations and legislators, and created a model for other states. This is like a significant, important climate change organization that operates at a state level. And this is what they say about themselves. I can get into that because it's a nice, it's saying some important things, but it feels it's pushing, right? Like it's saying, like, let me push at you these things I want you to sort of like recognize and respect about us. And I think if we step back and think about what's the donor identity and values that actually have some pull, that actually, if we could tap into, would pull the donor forward versus us trying to push them forward. One version, this is where this project landed as it happened, was if you care about our climate, this is the smartest way to make a difference today. Because what their donors valued, we came back from these conversations for like, where was the energy in those conversations? There was a lot of moral energy around the moral urgency of the cause, but there was a lot of intellectual energy. This was an organization whose kind of self-concept and whose like appeal is that all their donors are really smart. They're super educated on the issues. Through this organization, what they get to feel is that, like, of all the organizations that are out there working on environmental and conservation and climate stuff, this is the one that's like most sophisticated, most smart, most high level, and has like the best overall strategy to really make change. So like, if you want to think of yourself as, I'm a smart donor, I do stuff that really makes a difference, I don't just throw my money at causes, that's kind of the identity we were speaking to with this. Finally, I don't know if I've earned, frankly, a Harvey Milk quote here with this webinar, but you do have to give them hope. We talk an awful lot with organizations about negative versus positive framings, and there's just, at this point, a pretty solid body of evidence to suggest that, well, you may use negative framings and negative messages, threat-based messages, selectively to build urgency and to establish, especially if people don't recognize the urgency of something. You ultimately have to be driving toward a positive message that makes people feel like a positive aspect of themselves is being called forward, and that they are able to do something positive and meaningful that they value. So, use negative messages tactically where you need to, but the overall pitch has to be very positive and aspirational, because that's what we're doing with philanthropy. All right, I want to offer just a few thoughts about how you use messages. I want to come back to this question of what messages do you need? If you remember, because again, like you could have one big message, you could have 5 key messages, you could have a million messages that are on much more of a small scale level. Any of that works. But if you think back to our first webinar in the series, we talked about your case for support having like 6 different kinds of information. And for each of those, you need some messages. And you can kind of group those in terms of like the why messages, the what we're doing, and the who is involved in this story, which is us, the organization, and you, the donor. So I'm not going to get back into this. You can go watch the first webinar again if you want to see us really dive in on this. But which messages do you need? You probably need messages in each of these categories. And it might be one message per category, it might be a few different things. But these are the different kinds of information that tend to be needed. And then again, once you have those core messages, if you think back to all these sample messages that we just looked at, think about how if you had the good versions of those messages, you could build a paragraph around it to open your annual appeal letter. Or if you're doing a video, you could take one of those messages, find a personal story that taps into that message and go tell that story. Or if you're doing your social media plan, you could say, for this week, our social media calendar is going to be focused on this message. Or, the last 10 things we've posted have all been kind of about this. So what I'm seeing is that we need to go hit these other messages more over the next period. Having that just gives you a map. It makes your jobs easier. And again, once you start living that messaging life, you can have a message-driven case. That's what we're mostly talking about. If you're going into a campaign, you really need clear messages to drive the campaign. If you're trying to, alongside your normal fundraising, go raise money for some special projects, you can have clear top 5 messages or top 5 benefits about this new project we want to do. You can, if you're giving a presentation, if you're leading an event or structuring the message at an event, it's very useful to have those messages. And just day to day, I'm going to send someone an email. I'm going to try to make my case for something, for which restaurant we should go to. There's no level at which this doesn't become useful. All right, so this is what we wish for you. We wish for you to feel comfortable, confident, and empowered to go out there and bring your wonderful, clear, beautiful, humane message to the world with your organization and the work that you're doing. Would love to use the rest of our time for questions.
Great. Well, our first question is regarding your messaging example. Alzheimer's is the public health challenge of our time. How careful does one need to be in balancing being catchy versus precise? Alzheimer's is not technically a public health concern. It's a significant concern, yes, but not a public health one, whereas something like influenza is a public health concern.
Okay. So the case for Alzheimer's as the defining public health challenge of our time goes back to the point about messaging and substance. So that's actually a very provocative and very challenging and that message is really making a reach. So you do need a lot of substance to support that. The case for that, as I recall it, has a lot to do with the fact that there's an extraordinary wave of baby boomers approaching the ages at which people begin to show signs of Alzheimer's. The wave of diagnoses of Alzheimer's is going to be enormous over the next several decades. The extraordinary cost of Alzheimer's care, because of the nature of it, is eminently capable of bankrupting Medicare by itself, and that the unique nature of Alzheimer's in the burdens that it places on families has an ability to just ripple outward and affect more people more profoundly on both practical and financial and personal and emotional and social levels than just about anything else out there. So that's the case, is that so I might be, it's possible, it sounds like the question asker has a particular definition of public health and maybe a more epidemiological approach. I'd be open to that critique. There may be some other way to frame that that's more technically accurate. But the point of that message is this is the wave that's coming that's going to do the most damage to our collective well-being and lives, because this is a disease that's almost perfectly engineered to cause human suffering for people and families, because it's so widespread, because of the age profile of our population. So, you have your message, and then you need to follow that with this different substance to really deliver on it. And that's a tough one to support, frankly, because it's making such a bold claim. It's a good question, though.
Thanks, Andy. On a similar note, can you give some examples of balancing the negatives, for example, a deadly cancer or illness, with the aspirational overall message?
This comes up a lot, and one of the questions that I think we sometimes forget to ask is, does the audience need us to tell them about the threat? So like climate change is a great example. You might think that making the case for any climate-related project, you would, of course, need to just start with all of the awful statistics and trends and projections and, all the stuff that just, when you look at it, you get terrified and you feel like you have to act. And I think sometimes it makes sense to include all that and to start the case there before you move toward your sort of narrative about solutions and how you can make a difference. But in that case, if you're talking to an audience that already knows all that stuff and is already that's why they're already, that's why they're there talking to you in the first place, is because they know all that stuff and they are already activated by it. You may not need, it can be a little counterintuitive. Like you can be talking about the greatest threat to humanity ever and actually not need to say that much about that part of it because the people you're talking to already know. So there's sort of two separate questions. One is like, how much do you need to stir people up and activate them with potentially threat-based or negative messaging? But I think no matter where you land on that question, you do ultimately need to drive toward, even with something like climate change, how is this gift and this initiative or this project going to advance a new solution, create a model that can be replicated, make change on some scale that matters that maybe then we can follow on larger scales, or change the conversation around the topic. So, I think I'm trying to think of another example where maybe you do really need to expose people to the threat because they might not know it. I'm drawing a blank, live in the moment now, but you can think of cases where, like, the audience needs to be sort of woken up a little bit. That that if these trends continue, like I think that's actually part of the Alzheimer's message, is that like you sort of know this experience on their donors are people whose like have a family experience of Alzheimer's. They know it on that scale, but they may not know it on the societal scale. They may not have understood that what they've experienced in their family is there's a whole wave of that coming, and it's actually a societal problem. So that's where you might need to bring that in to raise the stakes, and then drive toward, here are the 4 things we're going to do about it. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Andy. Do you have specific insight for plan giving?
Interesting. Yeah, so plan giving, what are the messaging dynamics of plan giving? That's a situation where you really need to understand the relationship of the donor to the cause. Because plan giving is like, when you include an organization in your will, you're really making them a part of your family. You're really saying, in my sort of the final settlement of my affairs, you are on the list alongside my family members. Like, that's profound. So I think sometimes in plan giving messaging, you need to do a little bit more to just really reinforce and anchor that sense of trust, stability, legitimacy, like continuity over time. Because you're making an argument that's not just like, we're going to do this cool project in the next 5 years. You're saying, this organization has been trustworthy for decades and has the track record to be trustworthy into the future. So those kinds of messages, I think, messages of permanence, stability, and like lasting impact are important. So a lot of conveying trust in the organization. The other thing is just to really think about, why would someone, is it a legacy thing? Is it a giving back thing? Is it a, I want to be remembered and leave a legacy that is sort of respected and recognized within my professional community or my local community? Is it just a sense of like, this organization gave to me, so this is my time to give back? There's not a universal answer to those, but I really think about plan giving in terms of that. What is that deep relationship between the organization and the person, and what are how do we speak to that? So that's where we've tended to go with plan giving messaging. You see a lot of stuff, obviously, about sort of legacy. I think it's important to try to make that more specific, and to not just be saying leave a legacy, but to say what kind of legacy, to say what your legacy will be. It will be a future generation of children who are educated. It will be a next generation of professionals in your profession who are able to advance and learn, if it's like a professional society thing. So there's different ways of going with that, but it's so relationship driven. That's where I would look for the heart of those messages.
Thanks, Andy. And I think we have time for one last question. Do you have any advice on making a case to care about a topic that is either considered not important or far less important compared to when humans need help? This person worked at a wildlife rehab hospital where there's a group of people that inherently care, but it's hard to convince people that don't inherently value it.
Huh. Okay. So, yeah, that is, and I'm glad we got this question because it speaks to the very real fact that you can have different messaging strategies for your true believers and your people who are already bought in versus sort of your like acquisition messaging for people who are you think you can get to, but you haven't gotten to them yet. What you have to do in that kind of setting, and frankly, I'll be honest, we don't do as much of that as so much of what we do is about campaigns and major gift fundraising where the people are already on some level bought in. But when you're trying to bring in new people, you need to reach them through some aspect of their identity or values that you can sort of translate into your terms. So for animal care, or wildlife rehabilitation center, it may be that if you may not be able to approach that head on in terms of framing it as the most important social problem alongside housing, but if you can find a way to speak to people about the bond that they feel with animals in their lives, which so many people have that value, so many people have that identity. This is where you see things from vegan organizations about how a pig is like as smart as a dog. What they're trying to do is say, you're a dog person, pig equals dog. Like they're trying to speak to you through, find a back door into your, identity and values by speaking to someone that connects to you. So I don't want to venture too many irresponsible guesses for this organization, but I think that's your best chance. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much. We hope you'll come back for the next series or next webinars in the series, especially this next session with Christina and Kelsey talking about volunteers. We all have this problem. They've got some great ideas and some very tactical approaches to how to do this. It's something you could do this year to get your board members more engaged and effective with your message. So hope you'll come back for that one. Thanks everyone so much.